just might be right, Mr. Just might be right, Mr. Just
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At last, I'm sorry about the delay there. A few technical issues, as always, taking to the airwaves. This complex mess of technology that we call people's internet radio can cause a few little sticky moments from time to time. Please bear with me. Tonight's show is the postponed show from last week. This is going to be digital virtual reality theory, digital virtual holographic reality theory. Last week, in replacing tonight's show, last week I presented a sort of holographic reality 101, which if anybody didn't catch, I wouldn't be at all surprised because it was broadcast between 1am and 4am on Saturday morning last week. This is now my new home for the Omniversity. The Omniversity will be following Dr. Rock's show at midnight on Thursday, midnight GMT. Friday, midnight GMT. I tend not to keep up with the chat if it's busy. It's an unusual situation for the Omniversity to have anything like the number of listeners that we're seeing tonight. Just great to have you all on board. Thanks for Martin and Tony for covering for Nick and the Doctor this evening. Glad to see we've got Nick in the chat, obviously beginning to recover himself a little. Unlike to see Doc in the chat, simply because he's been having teeth extracted today and he's probably in the land of Nod by now, I should imagine. Tonight's broadcast will be largely intending to present an alternative model with which reality can be considered. Now, as with all models, they can only map a certain level of detail, and the reason why digital holographic virtual reality is so important, why you should care, is that because through our understanding that reality is digital, virtual and holographic, we can begin to understand sequences of events, the flow of the timeline as our perception interacts with it. And what I'm going to try and present is the amassing evidence that is beginning to point to the fact that not only is our consciousness key to understanding reality, in as much as the Newtonian, Einsteinian, fundamentalist, rationalist model has a huge problem when it comes to consciousness. In fact, the entire field of research of quantum physics has been driven by largely the results of a single experiment back in the 1890s. I think it was originally conducted, called the double slit experiment. Now, the double slit experiment is not a big, complicated experiment. In fact, I think you can even do it by just simply putting a normal electric bulb in front of two slots in a sheet of board, sheet of card, whatever, and you should see this diffraction pattern if you focus the slots, the gap between the slots, on the wall behind. So this is something that literally affects all of us. This is how time works, this is how substance works, this is how our minds construct what we perceive, and what we perceive is what we call reality. Now, the double slit experiment essentially led to something called the hard problem in science. The hard problem is essentially consciousness, and the double slit experiment was known for quite some time before the equipment became available for the detection of the actual particles or the actual material, the actual substance passing through the slits. the diffraction pattern that is ordinarily caused with an unobserved and unmeasured double-slit experiment is a sequence of dark and light stripes which can be seen on the screen. If we take a measurement at one or other of the slits, for the most peculiar and extraordinary of reasons, those dark and light stripes suddenly disappear, and we see what one would more reasonably expect if a something was being thrown through the slits, and we end up with two bright patches with dark surroundings and very little fringing. So probably best if I let one of the physicists describe the double slit to you. This is one of the physicists who's been working with holographic reality. This is Tom Campbell, who I interviewed many moons ago. There's a 3-hour interview on my Freeman Jack YouTube channel. I think it's called Tom Campbell Introduction to My Big Toe, Introduction to MBT. Just to explain, my big toe may sound a little odd, but the TOE is the theory of everything that Einstein spent the vast majority of his life working towards. And Tom Campbell believes that his work and the work of others has essentially created a meta set of theories of everything that constitute a big TOE, or a big toe. Now, this is Tom talking about the double slit experiment. I'm not actually going to bring much of his work to you tonight. This will be the only piece from him, because I feel it's just as important that you hear from those who maybe have very little connection with the direct holographic reality theory concept, but have perhaps stumbled upon elements of holographic reality by accident or by synchronicity in their own studies. Whether they entirely grasp what it is that they've found, I leave up to your own conclusions. But this is Tom Campbell. He's, like I say, a holographic reality physicist, ex-NASA statistician, worked with Ted Vollers, who is a physicist and theoretician, on his books.
Simple ideas, but they're hard to grasp because they are different paradigms. You have beliefs about the nature of reality, and these aren't intellectual beliefs. These are beliefs down at the gut level, down at the blood and sinew level. This is the kind of belief. They're cultural beliefs about this being an objective reality. And things I'm going to tell you will explain to you that this is not an objective reality, and I'll try to explain how and why that works, but it's going to be hard because all of those habits of thinking are going to be there as blocks in your way. I like talking about the theory because I'm a physicist and what I do is theory. But besides that, if you understand the theory, then it's much more easy for you to understand the application. If you don't understand how it works, then working with it, learning, experimenting, and growing with it is very, very difficult if you really don't understand what's happening or why. If you know the rules to the game, you're a much better player than if you don't know the rules to the game. So that's why I like to spend a lot of the time on a basic theory to get you to understand the nature of reality and how it works. That's what happens in these little spots here where there's no light. You see, between all these spots of light, that's where they canceled each other out. And all these little spots where there are light, that's where they superimpose together. Okay, that's a diffraction pattern. Simple physics back in the late 1800s. Okay, well known. Now, everybody was pleased with that until Einstein, some 2 or 3 decades after this was well known, did some experiments that showed that light came in discrete chunks of momentum. Well, that sounds like a particle. Well, it is a particle. Call it a photon. Now, light's a particle. Well, they said, if light's a particle, how do we get this diffraction pattern? Because we know particles act like this, right? Light goes through the slit. If it's a particle, it has to travel in a straight line unless acted on by an exterior force. It's Newton's second law or something like that. Okay? So we get a straight line and a spot of light, straight line, a spot of light if it's a particle. But yet light was doing this. Big mystery. So they wanted to solve this mystery by doing this experiment and firing one photon at a time toward those two slits. Just one particle at a time, instead of billions of particles at a time. And when they did that, they fired one particle at a time at these slits, and of course they had to keep doing one particle, another part, so they sent really tens of thousands of particles all together, but just one at a time. And when they did that, they expected they would get this, because after all, that's a particle. What they got was this. And I should also tell you that this experiment doesn't just work with light. It works as well with electrons, hydrogen atoms, and the biggest thing they've thrown through there is a buckyball. That's a 60 carbon atoms tied together in a shape like a soccer ball. It's huge and massive, compared to a photon. And they send buckyballs through there, and they do the same thing. When you send a buckyball at this, it turns into a diffraction pattern. Okay, so it's not just magic little photons that are massless particles that always go the speed of light, so they're kind of different, but anything will work. Okay, in fact, you could throw a toaster oven at it and it would work if you could scale the experiment enough so that the uncertainty of the trajectory of the toaster oven was like the uncertainty of these photons and buckyballs, you see. So it's impractical to do the experiment for things that are too big. Doing the buckyballs was hard enough because it was so big. They had the physical experiment gets more and more difficult the bigger the particle gets. But it's a general principle that if you could throw a toaster oven at that, and if you could do the experiment, the toaster oven, there'd be a bunch of toaster ovens there, and a few toaster ovens there, and a few toaster ovens there, and none of them in between. Because the toaster ovens would go through both slits, interfere with themselves, and then recreate over on the other side. Strange, isn't it? That was the problem. Now, they thought, well, there's something funny going on at this slit. Something about going through this slit that we don't know about, because we're sending one particle and we're getting a distribution that's a diffraction pattern, and that's just not right. It doesn't make sense. So let's measure what's going on at the slit. And these little red spots are detectors. They're just going to detect whenever a photon or an electron or a buckyball goes through the slit. They're just going to send a little signal and say, okay, one went through this slit. And when they detected what slit the particles went through, they got this result. Particles. Turn the detectors off. Oh, they got this diffraction pattern. Well, that's clear then. It's the detection's doing something to it. Well, that didn't turn out to be true, because they could leave the detectors on detecting and just not collect any data, or collect the data and then erase it, and they got the diffraction pattern. You see? So now everybody's head was being scratched, right? This doesn't make sense. And that's why this double slit experiment is such a big deal, and that's why everybody, does it all over the world, because what it tells you is that our reality is not objective. We don't live in a Newtonian objective reality. Our causality is not objective. Okay, the next slide will tell us how they fixed the problem. They fixed the problem by saying that a particle is not a particle. There are no really massy particles out there that we can't see them. They're just probability distributions. And I don't mean by that let's say that's a probability distribution in location of the particle. And it doesn't mean that it's out there somewhere as a particle and we just don't know where, and that's the probability distribution. It means that there is no particle. The particle itself is just represented by a probability distribution. Okay, now the reason that worked and got them out of the trouble is because part of the probability could go through that slit, and part of the probability could go through that slit, and the probability could combine with itself like a wave, and it could make a diffraction pattern. And then here, this little curvy wave that you can't see anymore that goes here, you can see it down here with the two humps. That became the probability distribution of the results. Okay. And that solved their problem because now they could explain the experiment, but it created a problem because now they said that particles aren't particles, they're probability distributions. So that was the solution. And the way the language went, they said when you made the measurement, you collapsed the wave function. This was a probability wave, and it had a wave function. It was this mathematical representation. When you made the measurement, here at these detectors, you made the measurement, you collapsed the wave function to a physical particle. Before that, it was just probability. Once you get a physical particle, then the physical particle has to act like a physical particle from then on. Now, some people said, well, I just can't believe that, measuring that particle creates the particle out of probability. There's something else going on there. And they thought, well, maybe it's when you measure it, you interfere with it. It's somehow that measurement process interferes with that particle and changes it somehow. But, of course, like I say, they left the detectors on, detecting. They just didn't collect the data, and they got the diffraction pattern. So that theory went out the window. That couldn't be the true, but because that was the only thing they had, a lot of people clung to that anyway and believed it was true because they wanted it to be true because that get them back into an objective reality. But it's not true. It's true that when you make a measurement, you get a particle. But it's not making the measurement. If you read this in the literature, you'll hear people talk about the measurement problem. The measurement problem is that it takes a measurement to make a particle out of probability, and that's too weird for people to accept. That's the measurement problem in physics. But it's not true that a measurement creates the problem. You also will hear that consciousness creates the particle. It's the conscious observer. It's the act of a consciousness observing the particle that makes it collapse its wave function down to a particle. That's not true either, although it does take a consciousness to make a measurement. So they're related. What it is it's about the information. If the information exists in this reality to show that it was a particle, in other words, a particle went through the slit, then it has to act like a particle. If there is no information in this reality to determine that it's a particle, then it acts like a wave. So the key thing is information. Okay? Well, this is reality is based on information. That's at the core of our reality, and that's what this says. Reality is merely an illusion. It's clear that the space of physics is not, in the last analysis, anything given in nature or independent of human thought. It's a function of our conceptual scheme. Space is a function of mind. And then at the end, Albert Einstein, after he worked the last 25 to 30 years of his life trying to come up with a unified field theory little toe, and didn't succeed, a letter to one of his co-workers. One has to find the possibility to avoid the continuum together with space and time altogether, but I have not the slightest idea what kind of elementary concepts could be used in such a theory. You see, they knew that the time of Newton was finally over, but they just really didn't know what to do with it. Because just knowing the fact from an experiment isn't enough. You have to have an explanation. You have to be able to relate it to the world before it's useful. Okay, the next one is Wigner. It will remain remarkable in whatever way our future concepts may develop that every study of the external world led to the scientific conclusion that the content of consciousness is the ultimate universal reality. Max Planck. Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature because in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of the mystery we're trying to solve. See, that's like Einstein saying the space of physics is a function of our conceptual scheme. What's out here, our reality, is somehow entangled with what's in here, is what they're saying. All right. Okay, now we're going to have one from Niels Bohr. Bohr said, the common sense view of the world in terms of objects that really exist out there, independently of our observations, totally collapses in the face of the quantum factor. He meant in the face of quantum mechanics, new knowledge that they just had. Also from Niels Bohr, if quantum mechanics hasn't profoundly shocked you, you haven't understood it yet.
Now that I can release
Okay, so we had Tom Campbell before the music break there with an explanation of the double slit experiment and essentially describing how much of a cat amongst the pigeons the observation problem caused when it was first discovered. I'm going to go a little more light-hearted here, and this is Robert Anton Wilson. Now, although Robert Anton Wilson was broadly a writer of fiction, one of his works of fiction or semi-fiction, a critique of quantum theory called Schrodinger's Cat, has actually gone down to join the list of many recommended books, recommended reading books, book lists on the book lists of prospective quantum physicists. So he's certainly one of the greater minds on the subject, and here he is talking about the nature of probability and how difficult it is to deconstruct reality with the restrictions of human language and the unspecificity of the majority of the language that humans use.
E prime is English without the use of any form of is or being.
We're trapped in linguistic constructs. All that is metaphor. I believe somebody said that before me. I've decided we can't get beyond words. What we got to do is get more cynical about our words. You'll find that by dispensing with is and trying to reformulate without is, you just naturally fall into the kind of expression which is considered acceptable in modern science. Also, it's the type of consciousness that Zen Buddhism tries to induce. Using E prime, you will understand modern science and Zen Buddhism both a lot better than you've ever understood them before. Martin Gardner has written a long essay proving that to think like this will destroy your mind. I think it adds tremendously to clarity. I am removing the is from my writing more and more. Removing it from your speech is even harder. Instead of thinking the grass is green, to think the grass appears green to me. And this saves me a lot of time, by the way. I don't get embroiled in arguments like Beethoven is better than Mozart, or rock is better than soul. I define such things as meaningless. And so people get into arguments like that. I just say, well, Beethoven seems better to me than Mozart most of the time. But I don't say Beethoven is better than Mozart.
I return to E prime in my thinking whenever I find myself getting angry at somebody or feeling depressed or hopeless or having negative emotional states in general. Once you put them in, and once you take out all the ises out of all your negative statements, you find out they're all relative to how you feel at the moment. People would, by and large, act the hell a lot more sanely, especially if they, when they got rid of is, they put maybe in more sentences. I think if everybody used maybe more often, the increase in general sanity would be absolutely, it would seem absolutely astonishing and completely flabbergasted everybody. What the hell is this? We suddenly got a planet full of sane people? When did that start to happen? I didn't even notice it. You just listen to the craziest people on the news and on television, or the craziest columnists in the newspapers. You notice they never say maybe. They're always quite sure. And they always know is. And they never say seems. They always say is. I'm continually astonished at all the people in the world who think they have the answer to everything. None of them ever suspect they might be cosmic schmucks and have the wrong answer. And I find the only explanation that makes sense to me is in Korzybski's Science and Sanity. These people don't know how to use language properly. They're using language in an overly dogmatic way, which sets their brain into overly dogmatic modes. So they think dogmatically, they perceive dogmatically, they even smell dogmatically, they hear dogmatically. They're locked in a trap of fixed neurosemantic circuits in their brains. Whereas knowing I'm a cosmic schmuck, I always think of at least 5 alternatives. When people start arguing about words, they're mostly arguing about whether the words that they apply to the objects they have created out of the infinity or possible objects that could be put together. They've picked up a few of them. Then they put words on them. Then they quarrel about the words. And if these people get to the stage where they're willing to kill one another over the words, they should be put in a nice quiet home in the country with kindly doctors and beautiful nurses and good sedatives. But generally they end up in government mansions and start bombing one another. Or they lead religious crusades for the true faith and kill one another with swords or some such thing.
The glorious Robert Anton Wilson there. Much of that recording there taken from his very last days on this planet as an incredibly wise old man. He continued to work right into the very depths of his infirmment. He was finally paralysed with his polio that he'd had as a child. It took about 50 years and came back and made a return. But he used E-Prime, and he literally used the power of the mind in order to construct a pleasant reality for his frail, infirm body to occupy. And I'd suggest that everybody should go to YouTube and dial in Robert Anton Wilson and just look for the final interviews that he was giving in his latter years. If you have any sort of pain, if you have any sort of discomfort, if you have any sort of infirmity or disability, go and look what that man was living through with a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eye, and still legitimately enjoying his life, admittedly with rather a lot of weed cookies being involved one way or another. But right, I want to move this on. I've presented to you the physical argument, the physicians, the physicists' argument for holographic reality, or at least the physicist argument against Newtonian reality, against clockwork reality. So far we've been presented with a case that suggests that reality is a probabilistic thing, that it behaves in probabilities until an observer observes it, and that the observer observing the probability collapses it into an actuality and makes it what we call real. Now, this may seem a bit of a stretch, but what I'm about to present to you now is the neurological case. This is Professor Jordan Peterson. He's a professor in neuropathology. He's I don't know whether he would necessarily describe himself as a Buddhist, but he's certainly very in touch with the Eastern schools. I think I would actually suggest that he used to describe himself as an atheist, but now has come to the conclusion that perhaps pure atheism isn't a full explanation of his subjective experience. But this is a very much more rigid. Again, this will be a university degree course that you're being presented with part of here. But in this case, you'll be being presented with that university degree course, or possibly even PhD course, as part of a childhood story that I hope that you're all familiar with, which is Timmy and the Dragon. If you're of the older generation like me, you'll be a bit too old to have had it in your childhood, but certainly for me it was one of the most frequently visited books when I was reading books to all of my children. So this is Dr. Jordan Peterson explaining precisely how we construct our reality on a neurological level. Incredibly interesting talk, this. 15 minutes or so.
So I'm going to tell you today about a way of looking at the world that I think is substantially different from the way that most people look at the world. And the way I want to tell you about looking at the world today is, I think, more inclusive than a standard sort of materialist view. Like the standard scientific view of the world, of course, is that it's made up of familiar objects, and that the world is, in essence, a material place. But there's some very potent limitations of that viewpoint, despite the fact that it's given us tremendous power. And the limitations are essentially as follows. The essential materialist view can't tell us anything about consciousness, which is probably the primary fact of experience. Neuroscientists in recent years, mostly in the last decade, have been trying to crack the problem of consciousness, and they have absolutely made no progress. They've tried to associate consciousness with neuronal activity, but that seems to be an incomplete answer because there's many forms of neuronal activity in the brain that aren't accompanied by consciousness at all. Not only do neuroscientists understand virtually nothing about consciousness, they can't even really figure out what its function is. They can't understand why our brains would go to so much effort to make us aware of things when it isn't clear at all that awareness is necessary for life, especially given that there are many life forms on the planet that don't seem to be aware at all. The standard materialist view is also insufficient in many other ways. It's insufficient philosophically, I think, as you probably all know, because a conception that portrays the world as made up of objects is in some really fundamental way dead. Right? It doesn't seem to have a place in it for human beings, or a place in it for meaning, or a mode whereby you might be able to conceptualize the real existence of something like an emotion, or a dream, or a motivation. All phenomena which are just as mysterious to neuroscientists and to scientists in general as consciousness. Now the problem with this seems to be mostly experiential. If you have to ask people what they know more than anything else, they know, number one, that they're conscious. They know, number two, that their internal experiential life is composed of emotions and motivational states, which, although not rational in essential structure, are so real and relevant that virtually everything that people do is predicated on them. So our current viewpoint, despite its ability to give us tremendous technological power, seems to eradicate from formal consideration many, many essential experiences that are vital to life, in fact, even perhaps primary. Now, I'm going to suggest to you today that there's an alternative viewpoint, and I think also it's one that, although you may be hearing about it formally for the first time, is also something that you know unbelievably deeply. How thousands of years ago, Plato proposed that all knowledge was remembering. And of course we don't believe that today because we believe we gather knowledge as a consequence of contact with the world. But you'll see today that the knowledge that I'm going to share with you will strike a deep chord of remembering, and it's because everything that you've done throughout your life is in one way or another predicated on what I'm going to tell you today. I'm going to demonstrate this in a peculiar way, I think, because I'm going to start by telling you a story. And the reason I'm going to do that is because models of the world that include phenomena like consciousness and emotions and motivations and actions and interactions are generally portrayed formally in stories and not in scientific theories. And it does turn out to be that stories themselves have an identifiable structure, even a grammar that makes them comprehensible. Furthermore, it turns out that even the simplest stories, especially if they're elegantly constructed, have an unbelievably profound underlying meaning. And you can frequently see this most particularly in children's stories. So if you go to a video rental establishment, you'll find that in the top 10 highest grossing movies of all time are 4 Disney movies that are animated fairy tales, essentially retelling of mythological stories. They strike a deep chord. Why? I'm going to tell you a little story to begin this off with. It's a kid's story written for children of about 4 years of age, but it's very, very elegant. I tried to cut it down for this talk, but I found I couldn't because it was so well edited that every single piece of it had to fit in to make the story complete. And I'm going to show you first the structure of the story. Now, Billy Bixby was rather surprised when he woke up one morning and found a dragon in his room. It was a small dragon about the size of a kitten. The dragon wagged its tail happily when Billy patted its head. It's interesting, you know, in Chinese mythology, the dragon is a positive figure. In European mythology, the dragon is something to face in combat and destroy, or something to face in combat and build something out of the pieces left over from the dragon. Billy went downstairs to tell his mother. There's no such thing as a dragon, said Billy's mother. And she said it like she meant it. There's a part of your brain that tracks threats, and it's not really all that smart in some ways. All it does is say, look, here's the problem. And it's waiting for the rest of your brain to conjure up some solution to that problem. And if it doesn't conjure up a solution, then it just presents the problem over and over and over and over and over. So people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, who've been really upset by their contact with something unexpected, dream about the same tragedy forever until they solve it. And they solve it by facing it and living it over and over, voluntarily. So you see, Billy, he's pretty much got it right off the bat, right? The dragon wagged its tail happily when Billy patted its head. Billy went downstairs to tell his mother. There's no such thing as a dragon, said Billy's mother, and she said it like she meant it. So there's a dragon in this house. Now, the next thing you might wonder is, how often have you actually gone into a house where there's a dragon? My guess is if you don't take this particularly specifically and allow yourself to use your imagination and to think metaphorically for a moment, you've all encountered dozens of houses that were filled right to the rafters with various dragons, all of which were being studiously ignored by the people who inhabited the house. Billy went back to his room and began to dress. The dragon came close to Billy in a friendly manner and wagged its tail, but Billy didn't pat it. If there's no such thing as something, it's silly to pat it on the head. Billy washed his face and hands and went down to breakfast. The dragon went along. It was bigger now, almost the size of a dog. Billy sat down at the table. The dragon sat down on the table. This sort of thing was not usually permitted, but there wasn't much Billy's mother could do about it. She'd already said there was no such thing as a dragon. And if there's no such thing, you can't tell it to get down off the table. Sometimes I sit with friends of mine who have very young children to eat, say. And the children, 2 or 3 years old, don't sit at the table, they sit on the table, or they run around the table, or they run around the table and pull things off the table, or they run around the house and pull things off all the shelves in the house and keep their parents so busy chasing them around that they have no time whatsoever to interact as adults. Well, you have to wonder under those circumstances whether you're dealing with a child or a dragon, so to speak. And you also might wonder whether or not the dragon is large and unruly, precisely because the parents are completely unwilling to admit that it actually exists. Mother made some pancakes for Billy, but the dragon ate them all. Mother made some more, but the dragon ate those too. Mother kept making pancakes until she ran out of batter. Billy only got one of them, but he said that's all he really wanted anyway. One time, I walked in the house, and the other 4 or 5 kids that we had in the house were off playing, and this little kid was standing in the corner, like really isolated and looking, upset fundamentally. So I went over and I poked him a bunch, because generally if you poke a kid a little bit, well, they'll go like this, they'll sort of back off. But sooner or later you can crack them and they'll smile and then they'll play. Not this kid, boy, there's no bloody way he's going to play with me. And that was that. Like, he'd already learned that adults should either be ignored or that they were trouble. And he wasn't going to let any adult into his little world. So there was absolutely a dragon associated with that little boy, and it was eating all his pancakes. Billy went upstairs to brush his teeth. Mother started clearing the table. The dragon, who was quite as big as Mother by this time, made himself comfortable on the hall rug and went to sleep. I really like this one. By the time Billy came back downstairs, the dragon had grown so much he filled the hall. Billy had to go around by way of the living room to get to where his mother was. I didn't know dragons grew so fast, said Billy. There's no such thing as a dragon, said Mother firmly. Cleaning the downstairs took Mother all morning. What with the dragon in the way and having to climb in and out of windows to get from room to room. So, you think back in your own experience when you've gone to a house where there's a dragon hiding underneath the living room rug and nobody's saying anything about it. And then you think, how long does it take to get something absolutely simple done in a house that's absolutely jammed to the rafters with unfinished business? Forever, right? Organizing people in a household like that, to even do something as simple as go out for breakfast in the morning, or even perhaps to make a meal, is virtually impossible. Why? Well, because there's something going on in the household that has been studiously ignored for a very long time and has grown so large as a consequence that it occupies the whole domain. By noon, the dragon filled the house. Its head hung out the front door, its tail hung out the back door, and there wasn't a room in the house that didn't have some part of the dragon in it. When the dragon awoke from his nap, he was hungry. A bakery truck went by. The smell of fresh bread was more than the dragon could resist. He ran down the street after the bakery truck. The house went along, of course, like the shell on a snail. The mailman was just coming up the path with some mail for the Bixbys when their house rushed past him and headed down the street. He chased the Bixby's house for a few blocks, but he couldn't catch it. When Mr. Bixby came home for lunch, the first thing he noticed was that his house was gone. Luckily, one of the neighbors was able to tell him which way it went. You know, that sort of thing happens to people not infrequently too, right? They're not really looking around much at what's going on, and they come home from work one day and their house is gone. And what does that mean? Well, maybe their children have become completely alienated from them, or maybe their wife has decided suddenly, but of course not so suddenly, to leave. Why? Well, according to this story, it's because something ignored was growing in the house. Mr. Bixby got in his car and went looking for the house. He studied all the houses as he drove along. Finally, he saw one that looked familiar. Billy and Mrs. Bixby were waving from an upstairs window. It means the same thing that's meant in the New Testament when you're told not to build your house on a foundation of sand, right? It doesn't matter how good the house is or how well constructed it is or how rich it is if the foundation is made out of sand or if it rests on top of a dragon. There's nothing in that household that's ever going to be accomplished that's positive. And the wealthy display that the house might consist of is nothing but a sham. Mr. Bixby climbed over the dragon's head onto the porch roof and through the upstairs window. How did this happen? Mr. Bixby asked. It was the dragon, said Billy. There's no such thing, Mother started to say. There is a dragon, Billy insisted, a very big dragon. And Billy patted the dragon on the head. The dragon wagged its tail happily. Then, even faster than it had grown, the dragon started getting smaller. Soon it was kitten size again. I don't mind dragons this size, said Mother. Why did it have to grow so big? I'm not sure, said Billy, but I think it just wanted to be noticed. So the first thing you might think about is just what happens if you don't pay a bill? Like really don't pay it, right? I mean, when it first comes in, it's only the size of a kitten. But if you leave it alone for 2 or 3 years, it pretty much grows into a full-fledged dragon. Why? Well, because things that you ignore have a life of their own, a complex life, like a bill. A bill is attached to a whole industrial complex, right? One of whose major functions is to make sure that you pay the bill. And if you don't pay the bill, then you immediately find out what it's connected to. It's connected to something immense and very troublesome, and if you allow the full force of that thing to manifest itself, it's not pretty. So, one lesson from this story is that if something's nagging at you, just a bit, it's probably better to deal with it before it turns into a full-fledged dragon. And then you might think, well, what if it's already a full-fledged dragon, right? I mean, then what's your option? There's nothing left but to run away. And so then I can tell you what we know from 50 years of studying the outcome of clinical psychological interventions. So let's take an extreme case, right? Let's say something truly terrible has happened to you, and as a consequence of that, you're in shock, post-traumatic shock, which is a condition that's sufficiently serious to damage your brain over time. It's not only a psychological disorder, it's a physical disorder. If you're really stressed, your cortisol levels shoot up. And if your cortisol levels shoot up, that cortisol in high doses is a neurotoxin, starts to damage your brain. So let's take a very extreme case and imagine that you've been violently sexually assaulted, and as a consequence of that, you're in post-traumatic shock. How do you get cured? So that means you can't really go outside. You certainly can't encounter anything that's associated with the event. Your sense of integrity and personal safety has been completely destroyed. Is there any way you can get back on your feet? Now, there's a woman named Edna Foa in New York, I think one of the world's top clinical psychologists, and she's been dealing with women who have post-traumatic stress disorder for decades. And she's found a treatment that works. And the treatment is this. She has the women relive the event in as much detail as possible, over and over in their imagination, with the accompanying emotion. And she's found, because she's done physiological measurements on her clients, that those women that allow themselves to get the most fully upset as a consequence of the reliving get better faster and stay better longer. The clinical evidence is absolutely clear. When you take someone to therapy, you're basically doing two things to them. Well, three. You allow them to confess what's wrong with them, because it's really useful to actually say what it is that's bothering you. It makes it clear and distinct. You help the person get their story straight, because you have to have your story straight, right? You have to know where you're coming from, and you have to know where you're going, because otherwise there's no structure for your life. And the third thing is, if your path from point A to B is being blocked by something that you're afraid of, you better learn to confront it, because if you don't, it will grow and expand until it turns into the kind of dragon that occupies your whole house. Anything that stops us on the path that we've chosen produces negative emotion. That's how we're set up. And our emotional systems are actually quite straightforward. We posit a goal. The thing about people is that we can posit virtually anything as a goal. That's one of the things that distinguishes us from animals. So we can all be thrilled to death when our favorite soccer team scores a goal, because we participate in what they're doing, the same way we participate in watching a protagonist on a movie or in a book. We can feel it. We embody it. We even know now that the neural systems that I utilize to watch a movie involve the same neural systems that the actor is utilizing acting out the part. So when you say you understand someone else, what you mean is your body is set to do exactly the same thing their body is, and your emotional systems are locked on exactly the same way theirs are. So when they experience something and you're watching it, you experience an echo of it. And that's what understanding means. And it turns out as well that those neural systems that allow us to embody someone else and to imitate them are right underneath the structures that we've evolved to use for language. And what that indicates is that mostly what we use language for is to tell stories. To tell stories about the way that people act, so that we can derive information, not about what the world's made of, because we don't really care about that in some fundamental way, but instead, how should we act? That's the fundamental question. How should we act?
Delightful. White Stripes there. Bound to pack it up. Good band. Go check them out. Lots of different music there. Okay, so we've had the physicist's model, and the consciousness problem, the observation problem. We have had the psychologist, the neurologist model of how our perceptions fundamentally affect our conception of what we experience as reality, and how distorted somehow that perception can become. So let's examine the very the slightly semantic and philosophical concepts of subjective and objective reality. Descartes was being mentioned in the chat earlier. We're kind of going into that territory now. I think, therefore I am. There is no such thing as an objective external reality. This is simply a matter of what we think of as objective. We see something in the external world, we call that an object. And so the very definition of objective and object constructs an external world view. However, truly objective truth is nothing other than a thought. Essentially, our brains are like a jellyfish floating in a brine soup. They're in a sealed container. They have no eyes, they have no ears. It has no eyes, it has no ears, it has no connection with the outside world other than through the central nervous system. Well, the central nervous system, as we know, is a very subjective tool. False limb syndrome, amputees can still feel the hand that they may have had amputated. The magician's trick on stage that convinces us that our view of reality is somehow wrong because their visual deceptions fool the eyes and trick the attention into looking the wrong way at the wrong moment. There's also an interesting psychological experiment with the gorilla in the room, where subjects are invited to sit in front of a screen and count the number of times that a basketball is passed between the members of players on the court. And because there's more than 7 players on the court and they're all dodging around all the time and the ball's constantly being passed between them, the observer is so wrapped up in their observation of the movement of the ball that they will not notice, and it's almost absolute, they will not notice when a man in a gorilla suit or a man in a bear suit walks across the middle of the court. And if you interview them on the way out of the experiment and ask them about the man in the gorilla suit or the man in the bear suit, they won't have seen them. It's literally not until you sit them back down in the awareness that that's what happened and you see the surprise on their face when they realise that a man blatantly walked amongst all of the kind of young, tall men in sports costume playing ball. And it's just simply that the observer can be distracted. So we're down to the evidence of our senses, and we've just established that they can be tricked. However, they're basically all that we've got. Now, those senses are all nerve impulses at their final, at their termination. At the neuron and the synapses and the axons and the dendrites and the nerves, the nerve bundles, at their final conclusion, they end at a nerve terminal. And this nerve terminal is an electrical device that sends electrical signals, electrical impulses, and these are what we have as our senses. This is what we perceive as our senses. It's a digital signal. Quite literally a digital signal. They don't come in waves, they don't come like a radio wave or pulses. They come quite literally as packets of information. Virtual, well, as the double slit experiment shows, a probabilistic reality cannot be conceived of as being hard and actual. So, reality is virtual. Holographic. Well, holographic is a little more complex. The concept of a holographic reality has been explored on some of the programs that I've done recently, and certainly a lot in the past. But essentially, what we know to be a hologram is best explored through a holographic plate, and through the use of an interference pattern, the same as in the interferometer in the double slit experiment, the diffraction pattern, the bright and dark lines in an illuminated area, by splitting a laser beam into two with a half mirrored surface and splitting the light and sending it 2 ways around a track. One beam of light illuminates the object and the other beam of light shines straight onto the coated plate of glass. These 2 beams interfere and they impart on both sides of the glass, which is photographically coated on the 2 sides, the grid reference, the data field of the 3-dimensional object, but now compressed into the thickness of the plate of glass. So however deep the 3D field is, and on some of these holographic plates they manage to get effectively whole room effects, where they manage to take an image of an entire room And in this hologram, you can quite literally look around the room. You can sort of look up people's noses. You can see into their mouths. It's a most peculiar effect. And when you're looking at the holographic plate, when you're rotating the thing in your hand, you're not actually seeing the image appearing in the glass plate, although you have to look through the glass plate to see the image. What you're actually seeing is the image being replaced into three-dimensional space as the hologram is decoded by your eyes back into its original three-dimensional information. Now, I would suggest that this is actually how reality is decoded into our perception. So what we conceive of as reality is a hologram. It's driven by perception, it's driven by consciousness, because consciousness collapses the probability field into particles. Particles are what we describe as reality. So the hard stuff of reality is the particles, and the particles are created by the awareness of some observer. And that this reality is a construct of a collective consciousness, that the reason why we don't exist in a purely selfish reality bubble all entirely of our own making is because we are individuated consciousness units. We are selves, but we are not only selves. We share our selfdom with many other selves, and each of those selves has a perception, an intention, and its own programmed reality. Because this is the thing, is that reality is programmed in from our birth, from the initial mapping of our initial state nerves and synapses, which will have largely been driven by our experiences in the womb, to our formative experiences, which also go to create those same synapses, dendrites and axons. And in fact the brain is grown rapidly to the age of about 7 years old. The synaptic connections basically just go in all directions, and then from about 7 to 21 there's a paring back of synapses, there's a refining of the synaptic connections, of the dendritic maps. And these dendritic maps are literally the maps of our reality. They're the things that our perception is experienced through. And so the what we think of as reality is quite literally hardwired into our brain by the perceptions and the insistences of those that put it there, our mothers, our fathers, our peers, our brothers and sisters, our teachers at school, the television. All of these things go to construct this interior landscape, this interior map on which the hologram is projected from. Right, okay, I want to move on to some more slightly detailed areas of holographic reality theory, and it often helps having somebody to bring these things out of you. One recent appearance I had was on Dr. Rock's show of last week, and when I reviewed the audio, I'll be very hard pushed to put this any better for you tonight. So I'm going to simply play through a 20-minute or so segment of my appearance on Nick M's show this time last Thursday.
So another question that's been somewhat bugging me for actually a couple of years since I started talking to you about these things is if not the Big Bang, then what?
Numerical flux.
Yeah.
Numerical flux and the evolution through the dimensions from probably a non-dimensional to the quadridimensional that we have today.
Right.
So it's entirely possible that we may evolve additional dimensions, but I don't think they exist currently.
Maybe what we're working at now, I've heard that as a theory, that, you know, the third dimension is the gateway to all the others, but at the moment the gate is closed.
Mm.
And certainly once you start thinking about what you're describing as the human entity and what it's capable of, and neural plasticity and all of that, once you attach it to a kind of global computer, you've you're already starting to deal in dimensions that are a little bit weirder than what we're used to.
Absolutely. I mean, the sort of the global mind thing as well. It's really very hard to kind of to separate this appearance of human, the sort of specialty of human consciousness, but the importance of our sensation of other awarenesses, other lower orders of awareness. And that knowing that how everything's fractal, that just makes me think that everything is consciousness, that the planet that we stand on, that the sun that we orbit, that the galaxy that we live in is somehow some sort of supra-consciousness, and that what we're actually experiencing is some kind of a geometric standing wave in that greater consciousness set, and this is essentially what we're experiencing as reality. The computational surface on which we experience the computational surface that we experience as reality is effectively the sort of standing waves in the thoughts of this sort of supra mind, this galactic mind or universal mind.
One huge single vibration.
Which would effectively make us like synapses. You know what I mean? We'd be the input-output terminals of a greater mind.
Yeah. So, I mean, naught-dimensional space, that's quite a difficult idea to get your head around. It's this whole unbelievably massive thing started as absolutely nothing in nowhere.
Well, again, you see, even this thing of the massiveness of space is only down to redshift.
It kind of occurred to me just as I was saying it. I thought I'm going to have my balls chewed for that one.
We covered this on New Year, that the actual only observations that we've got that actually place any extrasolar objects at a known distance is those that have been taken by parallax, and that's because they're effectively, again, this triangulation. So by taking an observation in, say, summer equinox and winter equinox, you're at two 180-degree polar opposites of the sun, and are of a known orbital distance between. So there's your base of your triangle, the gap between the Earth at summer and winter. And then you take an observation of a star, and you triangulate between those two, and then you observe any star's movement in front of or behind the observation of that star, and you can you can triangulate between those 2 points and calculate the actual points in space that those two objects occupy. Yeah. And essentially that can only be achieved up to, I think it's not even 50, I don't even think it's 50 light years. So the only universe that we've actually mapped through triangulation to anything that we can actually be certain of distance-wise is the very local area of the galaxy.
Well, doesn't that give us potentially significant problems with distant objects that we've found hard to identify? Things like pulsars and quasars
But the huge Crab Nebula galaxies and things like this that we're given as billions of light years across may be very, very small and very, very close.
Right. So it might be like was it Spike Milligan who said the sky's full of holes where the rain gets in, and the holes are very small, which is why the rain's thin. That we were talking about Isaac Asimov last time we were chatting, and I've been reading a book by him called Exploding Stars, and it's basically about the development of the telescope and how we found more and more stuff the further and further we could look. And Jimmy, I think it was, put a question into the chat box saying, how do pulsars fit in on galactic scales? And I find myself wondering just how accurate we are on things like pulsars and quasars.
Completely inaccurate.
Right.
Completely. There's nothing there that we can actually call a metric yet.
Right. So oh wow, really?
The reason
so
why
disappointing.
Pulsars are credited with this enormous power is because they're conceived as being incredibly far away. Again, they may be very local. They may even be just outside the solar system, because if all we've measured them with is redshift, then we don't know where they are.
And like you're saying, out beyond a given point, we have only measured things with redshift.
Yeah, anything beyond, I think it's 50,000 light years. 50 light years.
Excuse me, was that the rug just being pulled from under our feet? Was it? So, yeah, at that very beginning point from non-dimensional space, we're imagining simply on and on-off state of some sort starting to become on and off.
Fluxation may be the basically the initial miracle. If my theory has a give me one miracle and I'll explain you the rest, then why everything should be in persistent fluxation at every level is probably the only inexplicable part. And it may just simply be it may just be that is the rule, along with beneficence and obsolescence. So it would appear that if you combine fluxation, natural fluxation, so the natural desire for two coincident areas of space or areas of matter to desire not to occupy exactly the same state. So if one's positive, the one next to it will go negative. If one's hot, the one next to it will get cold. Mm-hmm. And this just appears to be the state of nature, that this appears to be what the stuff of reality is made from, is two assumptions of fluxation and of beneficence and obsolescence being the anti-entropic arrow. The anti-entropic directional arrow. So generally speaking, things are seen to be moving from hot and simple to cold and complex, but there also appears to be this counter force, this anti-entropic force, which appears to be this kind of beneficence, this preference for beneficence. Evolution, nothing solar, galactic, planetary, biology, computer, every sort of evolutionary track that you can possibly track would be impossible without the action of beneficence being preferred and obsolescence being eroded.
So the cosmos really is on our side.
It's on the side. If you happen to be on the side of going in the direction of beneficence and moving away from obsolescence, then it appears to benefit your trajectory. It appears to grease your wheels, and that I would suggest is what happened with those synchronicities in that video clip.
Yep, and as observed, that principle works right the way down to kind of human relations.
And moreover, the all of the principles of the philosophy that I'm sort of projecting were all encapsulated into the doing of the show, the talking of the show, of the recording of it, of the creating of the video. So we've got kind of a fractal compression going on so many different levels that effectively that work was a work of a fractal scalar. Yeah,
there was something else going on.
And again, this is kind of muse thing. This isn't. Everybody keeps pointing to me and going, "You're saying this." Well, yeah, the words are coming out of my mouth, but they're largely unbidden and don't appear to be particularly of or from me. They appear to be coming through me. I feel like a conduit. I feel like a pipe with something coming out, and it's not coming out of me. It's going through me.
It's kind of characteristic of something you said when we last spoke was. Chaos appears to fall out of the process fractal iterations regardless of what the initiating state is. So do you think there's an actual kind of movement towards order rather than chaos?
Well, again, I would suggest that in that Rule 23 process fractal where the chaos begins to look very organic, I would suggest that that's, again, an oversimplification, and what you're not seeing there would be the invisible anti-entropic force that would be going in the other direction. Right. The counter-rotating toroid. So essentially with those process fractals, with the pyramid, with the triangle, the two-dimensional triangle that you're seeing of that process fractal, in nature, that would actually be the outward sort of funnel of that co-joined, counter-rotating bitoroidal structure that you'll see all the way through that video sequence from the Primer Fields video.
Yeah.
Where you have the two donut-shaped vortices connected through their central point and meeting at a foci, a focus in the middle, and this it basically explains stars and planets and atoms and why everything's spherical and why everything appears to have an energetic flow that appears to adhere to a geometric structure, and that geometric structure appears to be defined by the 5 EBM array, by Marco's work, Marco Rodin's work that Vid interviewed that time.
Yeah. So you basically got, instead of this...
It's insane that he couldn't answer any of my bloody questions. Man's lost the plot. Why is it that all these people, they get a fragment of this? They get a fragment of this and they see deity.
Yeah. Or they wonder...
They don't have the whole model, because they don't have all the rest of it, because they've just found their one bit, and it's like, wow, look at this. And then when they sort of stand back and sort of marvel at it, they think, well, how the bloody hell can that exist? And end up having to resort back to their Judeo-Christian kind of paradigm, or their tyrannic Kabbalistic philosophies, in order to construct some sort of semblance of sense out of what it is that they've stumbled upon.
And yet what we're talking about is basically an on and off state and a rule, a signal of some sort. And then it just happens.
I'm not entirely sure that the digital part of the I think that binary is possibly, again, it's useful to think in terms of computers, and it's useful to think in terms of data being transmitted digitally, and digitally being a succession of on-off states. But I think that it's entirely possible that the actual data stream itself may be effectively three-dimensional. And so to break it down to a string of on-offs is probably doing it a huge injustice. And while each information packet may be an on-off state, that the way that we receive them is in a three-dimensional matrix. And so those data streams are coming in from all directions and essentially interfere. The reality that we perceive is that standing interference pattern, the standing wave in the background fluctuations.
Right. So it's basically a system exchanging information with itself.
And the only way that, I mean, you kind of can go to some of the sort of Zen Buddhists and how creation, the creation myth in Zen Buddhism is that the monad kind of got bored.
Yeah.
Because it didn't have anything to do.
Nobody to talk to.
So it'd have somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
And thus was created the universe.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we have this. We certainly appear to live in a dualistic state of positives and negatives and norths and souths and hot and colds, and the nature of reality as we experience it appears to be the spiraling vortexes and the interplay of the emanating fields from those spiraling vortexes. That the interplay of those fields, forces, and rotations are what generate the sort of interlacing field that creates the hologram that we think of as reality.
It strikes me that what your description just there really reminded me of was the human endocrine system, and how it is that several different organs produce many different chemicals and signal transmitters and stuff actually in real time, kind of vibrationally. Nobody seems to really understand how it is that one endocrine organ produces a load of responses to a second primary endocrine organ. But well, funnily enough, there's a scientist currently making an awful lot of money by creating novel scent molecules, by predicting what they're going to smell like by their electrical properties. And he's also done a lot of research into the action of nearly all of the psychotropic drugs, including all the sort of medicines and their action. And it would appear that something like the action of a benzodiazepine in the whatever it is receptor that it fits in the brain
is not just because it's a key and a lock, which is the sort of chemical model that we were always given before,
Yeah.
but that in fact it's a wire it's a plug in a socket.
Right. So it's more like more like a telephone exchange.
Yeah.
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 And it essentially completes that circuit.
And so all of that's electrical as well. Got a question from Jimmy in the chat box.
Ball. How about that for starters? No, go on, question.
Is Jack aware, says Jimmy, that redshift has been observed on incoming comets due to release of X-rays?
Again, the understanding of redshift has to be questioned as being velocity, and the only reasonable alternative that's being offered other than velocity is the energetic state of the quantum upshift of the electron. Again, having to refer slightly to quantum theory here, but a photon is released when the electron returns from a higher state, energetic state, from an outer ring, and it jumps back down to a lower ring. And as it jumps down to the lower ring, it has to release a packet of energy, and that packet of energy is what we call a photon.
Yeah.
And so, where was I going with that? So essentially, the energetic state of the atom that released the photon affects the colour of the photon that's emitted, and so we tend to see that lower order energy states put out red light, and higher order energy states put out blue light, as can be seen by electric arcs and flames. And if your flame's burning well, it's bright blue. If it's burning badly, it's yellow. Blue indicates hot, yellow indicates cold.
Oh,
so essentially the colour of the light as it's being received from the comet as it enters the solar system, it's going to be subject to a bow shock, an electromagnetic bow shock.
Yeah.
That's going to raise the energetic exchanges, the thing that's... Well, again, how are X-rays coming off a bloody comet? How's a comet emitting in the X-ray? Well, the only thing that emits in X-rays, things that are subject to huge electrical forces, are radioactive.
Yeah. So
we have to be hugely radioactive to emit X-rays to a degree that we'd be able to read them on Earth.
Which isn't
so
what...
if there's X-rays coming in from comets, there we go. We might as well go there. The sun's hollow. There's nothing in there. There's no sun in the sun. There's just a big ball of plasma, and that plasma is electrical. And it's this bi-rotating toroidal structure with its two inner surfaces extruded to meet in a centre, in a co-joined centre. And at the point of that co-joined centre of the two counter-rotating bitoroidal structures, or the counter-rotating bitoroidal structure, is what we know as a sun. And so what you have is these two enormous donuts extending far out into space and essentially gathering and recirculating the galactic electrical energy that's simply harvested by the motion through the heavens. It could be etheric, or it could simply be electromagnetic. I mean, we could simply be talking about a big electromagnetic effect here. We've got a galaxy that's a huge electromagnetic effect, and so it may just simply be like the galaxy is just like a huge electric motor that moving a conductor through a magnetic field is going to induce a current. And so what we see as a sun is literally just the visible sign of that induced current being focused about an intensely small point in space. And as we can see from the primer fields, we might as well refer to them here. If anybody wants to see this in action, you can go to the original videos that I used in my animated Electricity, the Universe and Everything animation video. And if you go to the original primer fields, you'll see this chap who's basically developed these two magnetic bowls, where the inside of the bowl is one magnetic pole and the outside of the bowl is the other magnetic pole. So they're basically like a bar magnet, but curved into the shape of a bowl and with a hole in the middle.
Yeah.
And he's got one set that's a north pole on the outside and a south pole on the inside, and another set that's a south pole on the outside and a north pole on the inside. And by bringing these two magnets into close proximity, but with an air gap in a bell jar that's been evacuated, so a partial vacuum in a bell jar, and then introducing into a cathode and an anode held above and below the outside of the bowls, he's able to focus that electrical plasma to such a point that he effectively creates a sun in his living room. And you've got this sort of golf ball-sized sun suddenly appears between these two balls, and you don't really need any more bloody explanation.
Those Primer Fields videos are utterly amazing. So
they explain atomic structure, electron rings. You can see it all in there. Those two magnetic fields basically describe everything that we know to rotate.
Loads of geometry too.
And that's why those are the primary video that gets repeated almost on a loop all the way through the back of my... If you can get those primer fields, if you can understand those primer fields videos, and you don't really need to understand them, because when you see them, it's self-evident. He shows you what the shape of the fields are that his bowls create, and then he shows you the bowls, and then he puts them in the bell jar, and then he evacuates the air, and then he applies a voltage. And actually, there's one little key bit in that I wish I'd lifted, because there's actually one where he separates the bowls, and you see, our red sprite video, our electricity or biology video that I put up with the huge 60-kilometre tall red lightning sprites.
Yeah, beautiful.
Looking like trees.
Amazing.
Well, he actually ends up with a structure that's almost identical to that. And what colour is it? It's red. He separates the two magnets out, and instead of having that bright, intense ball in the middle, which is exactly what I'm saying biology does, that the two fields separate, and that's why we see a trunk, you see a perfect thick trunk appear, and above the balls you see a big branching structure that looks like a canopy, and the lower structure goes out and is much more diffuse and looks much more like a root structure, but it's only on screen for a few tenths of a second, just while he's like fiddling around with the bowls to get them just right for the sun effect. He stumbled across that and he's like, wow, atoms, suns, wow, and then missed the fact that he also explained a tree.
Yeah, or a brain.
Or a brain, or a lung, or a kidney.
Yeah.
Or a dividing cell, or a lightning strike, or...
So I thought I understood you from one of our earlier discussions to say that magnetism arises when there is a current flowing.
Not quite. That's how magnetism arises in a electrical circuit. However, the exact same effect is effectively frozen into a magnet because of the electrical properties of the crystalline structure of the magnetite or whatever the magnetic material is.
Yeah.
So essentially the electron dipole is frozen in, is locked into the magnetic structure because of the crystalline structure of the material.
Right.
So essentially the shape of the crystal and the asymmetry, the polarized asymmetry of the crystalline structure of the dendritic structure of the metal, or the crystalline structure of the ceramic, like the neodymiums and all these sort of magnets. Well, essentially, as you're creating the magnet, you'll have to induce the magnetic field into it on the point of creation, and then essentially once that's been created, that is frozen into the crystalline structure and remains there essentially for time immemorial. Mm-hmm. It doesn't, but it's as near as damn it.
Because his magnets.
And again, and also you can magnetize things like steel, but it's a much more transient effect. You can magnetize an iron nail with any big magnet or with an electromagnet, so it becomes a permanent magnet. But it's not really a permanent magnet because that magnetism kind of fades. And if you bang the thing with a hammer or bash it on the bench, it stops being magnetic.
Just like that.
So basically you've put the energy in to reorder all the electrons.
Yeah.
And now they're random again.
So he's used some pretty clever technology to make those magnets of his.
I should imagine they're actually quite straightforward to make. It would just be a matter of how you magnetise them. You would need to magnetise them over a kind of some sort of a ball Gauss.
Yeah.
What would that be? It wouldn't be a Gauss meter, would it? It would be I don't know, whatever you put Gauss into things with. Butcherina.
He does. I love one of my favourite bits. We're coming close to the end now. It's already it's coming up to midnight. one of the things that I really enjoyed about those videos, the scene I remember best was when he kind of lodged a ball bearing into the little hole in the bottom of the cups, and then shot those 3 cans off the edge of the desk that said dark matter, dark energy, and black holes on them.
Yeah, I'm really digging for that.
There it is, just kind of all stored up in these little magnetic cups.
And moreover, those balls aren't even actually held. There's no physical retention in those magnets. I don't know if you realise that, but when he's firing those ball bearings through there, those balls are actually hovering in midair before he pings them out.
Yes, I had noticed that. They're actually held in the magnetic field themselves, aren't they?
Right, okay, so back onto digital, virtual, holographic reality theory. In the recording with Dr. Rock there, with Nick M, we were covering some of the elements of beneficence and obsolescence and the importance of numerical flux. Let's just kind of explore that subject a little more. So numerical flux is likely to be the substrate, the matrix, if you like, the background reality on which the hologram is generated. And that if we are to take one miracle to explain our reality with this theory, we must take that miracle to be that everything fluxes, that there's a constant fluctuation at every level that we observe reality. There appears to be this dipole, this constant rotation around a central point, this constant seesaw effect, if you like, and that whatever a coincident point in space, whatever a coincident atom in a substance, whatever a coincident wave in a light beam adopts, then the next coincident light beam particle area of region of space will adopt a numerically different state. So in thermal systems we see a constant fluxing of temperature. No coincident region of material, of medium, shares exactly the same numerical state as its neighbour. It may share the same average numerical state as the body of the medium, but on an atomic level the energies are essentially being exchanged, and that exchange induces this flux. Now, my theory would suggest that beyond the atomic flux, beyond the Bose-Einstein condensate flux of gas pressure, of vapor point, that we have beneath that a numerical flux, a sea of number, a three-dimensional sea of number, if you like, of numerical values that refuse to have coincident values to their neighbour, and that the fluctuations, the waves of flux that pass through that numerical sea, like the waves on the surface of a topographic sea, but in 3 dimensions, in a 3-dimensional matrix, that eventually the numerical sequences that create the reality that we experience would have been an ultimate conclusion. That strings of significance, that strings of self-maintaining, self-consistent, self-coherent, numerically evolutionary strings of ones and zeros, if you like. Number is immaterial at this level. What we're actually talking about is metrics. What we're actually talking about is difference. Okay, so when we're talking about number here, we're talking simply about difference. Okay, and that within these strings of algebraic sequences, that in order to acquire evolution, in order to acquire internal coherence, in order to project into greater more complex structures, that a beneficence must have been at play as an anti-entropic force, and obsolescence would then be the entropic force that eats reality as it complexifies. So between these sort of three, this sort of trinity of reality, of numerical flux, of beneficence and obsolescence, we can see how every evolutionary system, and it would appear that every system that we observe appears to have had a numerical progression and geometric progression through the medium of time. So let's go to three-dimensional reality. I think that the easiest way of really explaining how the hologram is perceived as this kind of high-def 3D immersive reality that we think of as stuff and substance, the easiest analogy, the easiest metaphor that I can give you is the device that you're actually listening to my words on now, a stereo music system, preferably a stereo music system. Now, should you have your speakers placed at approximately 6 feet, 4 to 6 feet spacing, and facing you at this moment, and should I be speaking into a stereo microphone instead of into a mono microphone, then my voice would be being encoded between the two microphones. The distance between my mouth and each of those individual microphones, and the speed and vibrato of my voice as it was induced by the voice coils of those microphones, would impart a signal into the wire, and through the magic pixies of electricity in the interweb, it would be delivered finally to your speakers, and through the process of amplification, that tiny signal would be then reproduced through your stereo into the cones of your speakers, and the cones of your speakers induced two conical waves, diffraction waves, into the air of your room. And what actually happens with stereo is the reason why it's so realistic, the reason why when it's good, it's really good, why when it's good, it's really immersive, is because when the music or the voice as a stereo signal is reproduced through your reproduction equipment, it literally recreates the three-dimensional soundscape of the thing that was recorded. And I would even suggest that if the recording has been done with enough attention to this specific detail, I would refer specifically to the music from the Need Plays, the David Byrne brass and spoken word piece that I'm often playing. I think there's some of it earlier in the show. If not, I'll play some later. Was recorded from two microphones suspended in the ceiling of the auditorium. And if you replay that particular piece of music on a piece of reproduction equipment of a suitable quality, that you can literally hear individual sections of the band standing up when they solo. And even I struggle to explain how an up and down signal is imparted into a simple left and right signal, but I can absolutely assure you that it is. And the stereo filled image, you can imagine like a grain of rice, like a sort of 4 foot wide, 1.5 foot deep grain of rice floating in midair somewhere in between your speakers. And if you don't notice that effect, then what you need to do is to adjust the face of your speakers. Ideally, you want your speakers effectively facing forward and equidistant from your ears, although the equidistance from your ears isn't absolutely necessary then to be equidistant from each other. I'm on air. In a minute. That's all right. This lozenge, this kind of mid-air lozenge that the interference pattern from the two of your speakers will create through their conical interference waves into the room will effectively be a three-dimensional environment. And in fact, if you can create it through your system effectively enough, you'll find that it doesn't matter which way you face in that environment, you will still perceive the stereo field, the left and the right. But also, having done that, you'll find that you should be able to move to all sorts of other rooms in your house and still effectively hear what appears to be a stereo signal, what appears to be a three-dimensional signal. So what's the consequence of these three-dimensional fields? Well, effectively I would suggest that reality as consciousness perceives it is effectively like a three-dimensional surface within this numerical flux. Probably a geometric surface. I think certainly the easiest way to conceive of consciousness is as a three-dimensional platonic solid, with each of its points, with each of its tips being an input and an output, and with each of the interconnecting lines being a numerical algebraic term, which would mean that any data being received by any of the points and all of the points simultaneously will be simultaneously algebraically, numerically transmitted to its neighbouring geometric point, at which point it will either become an output or a throughput, being sort of internally rotated. And I believe that this is literally what our reality is constructed on. Now, I've presented quite a bit of evidence of sorts of various fields of science that are sort of stumbling upon this, and one of the scientists that I feel that's probably more open-minded than most on the subject is the theoretician James Gates, Professor James Gates. And he is one of the theoreticians working on string theory. And although I don't necessarily think that he is an adherent to the holographic reality model, I would suggest that his work on string theory certainly suggests that a lot of fields of science are kind of incidentally finding proofs of the holographic model. And certainly his Adinkra, to my mind, are one of those proofs, or at least something that's a strong indication that if his work is meaningful, then it's meaningful in that it reflects some deeper truth about the reality as we experience it. So here's Professor James Gates and talking about his Adinkras. This is from the Isaac Asimov 2011 lecture. You can go and find that on YouTube. It will be in the links of the YouTube of this.
I'm for the humility of the humanity. You know, like, yes, we're really smart, but to have the notion that we can find not just all the laws that exist in this universe, but also the laws that define the laws in all possible universes, and hence understand this one in particular. It's quite a, which doesn't mean I'm a pessimist. I think we should go there. We should totally try. But we should keep in mind that everything should, in the end, be grounded in what we can measure of reality.
But can I just say, Marcelo, that we have had incredibly successful examples of unification. Obviously, certainly, our understanding of matter is more or less unified in an incredibly successful model, where we understand that light isn't different from electromagnetism isn't different from weak forces or strong forces. Where do you draw the line? I mean, would you have drawn the line before that great success? Would you have said, we have we shouldn't be thinking about unification with matter, we'll never get there, and it's just too much to expect?
In other words, Marcelo, 100 years ago, what would you have been saying?
I would have been saying that the unification of electricity and magnetism is not perfect, only in empty space. And that is true. If you look at the sorry about this, guys. If you look at the Maxwell's equations that basically describe how electromagnetic waves propagate in space, they are beautifully perfect, symmetric whenever you don't have any sources of electricity and magnetism. If you look at, sources, they're not perfect anymore. And just to make a comment about this, yes, we have unified, and I think the tendency of unification, of simplifying our knowledge of nature is absolutely key. That's what we all want to do. That's what we'd like to do. And in fact, the standard model, which is what Jana is talking about, is a magnificent achievement in which we can describe everything that we know of particles, in terms of 12 particles, and that's just beautiful. However, it's not a pure unification in the spirit that, say, superstring theory would like it to be, because each one of the forces, electromagnetism, strong, and the weak interactions, keep their imprint in the theory. And what we really want in the so-called grand unified theory or gut theory is that these three things become one. And the standard model certainly does not do that. It's really bringing them together in a sort of a patchwork way. And that is, in fact, one of the reasons why we want to go beyond that. That's one of the motivations for string theory.
Jim, have you gone beyond that?
Brian is...
Well, it's been very interesting sitting on the stage and listening to my colleagues. But, and I am far from experimental physicists, as you can imagine. But this is why experimental...
Which means you're a theorist. Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah, okay. It's code for I'm a theorist.
I'm a theorist, exactly. But my point is that it is always the case that it is our experimental colleagues that prevent us from forming a religion, because it is always grounded in what they can measure, as Marcello keeps coming back to. And so although people can express either enthusiasm or dismay about where we are at a given point in time, I think that we need to be a little bit more humble and to understand that the process that we engage in is a constant flight from fantasy about what we would want to happen, and we query nature for that, and that query goes through experiment. So although this has probably been very entertaining for my audience here, I think that at the end of the day, we have to keep grounded in it's got to be about things that affect your lives, and those things are measurable things.
So where has this pursuit taken you?
Oh my God.
Where have you landed?
Why would you ask that?
I'm asking that here and now. It's New York City. It's okay. March 7th.
Well, partly it's taken to these very strange images that are behind your head right now. These are pictures of equations. I've been, for the last 15 years, trying to answer the kinds of questions that my colleagues have been raising. And what I've come to understand is that there are these incredible pictures that contain all the information of a set of equations that are related to string theory. And it's even more bizarre than that, because when you then try to understand these pictures, you find out that buried in them are computer codes just like the type that you find in a browser when you go surf the web. And so I'm left with the puzzle of trying to figure out whether I live in the matrix or not.
Wait, you're blowing my mind at this moment. So you're saying, are you saying your attempt to understand the fundamental operations of nature leads you to a set of equations that are indistinguishable from the equations that drive search engines and browsers on our computers?
That is correct. So
wait, I have to just be silent for a minute here. So you're saying as you dig deeper, you find computer code writ in the fabric of the cosmos?
Into the equations that we want to use to describe the cosmos, yes.
Computer code?
Computer code, strings of bits of ones and zeros.
It's not just sort of resembles computer code, you're saying it is computer code.
It's not even just is computer code, it's a special kind of computer code that was invented by a scientist named Claude Shannon in the 1940s. That's what we find very, very deeply inside the equations that occur in string theory and in general in systems that we say are supersymmetric.
Okay.
Time to go home, I think. Where are we going to go? So are you saying we are all just, there's some entity that programmed the universe and we're just expressions of their code?
Well, I didn't say that. Some of those
like the Matrix? That's what you said.
Some of those codes are showing on the screen behind you right now. They don't look like codes, but these pictures, which we call adinkras, are graphical representations of sets of equations that are based on codes. So this is, in fact, to answer your question more directly, I have in my life come to a very strange place because I never expected that the movie The Matrix might be an accurate representation of the place in which I live.
Jim, may I give you an argument that we don't live in the Matrix?
Please! Yeah.
A very simple argument.
Linguistic specificity, why it matters, why it counts. In case you haven't noticed, it's almost impossible to think without words. It would appear that the very nature of our consciousness itself appears to self-reflect using linguistics. Now, whether linguistics are an abstract value system that has been overlaid over some underlying sequential pattern that describes our reality, and we merely experience our perception, our conscious awareness of that data stream as a linguistic flow of thoughts. But I would actually suggest that certainly with my experience of plastic reality, that the specificity of language is key in order to order one's intent. One cannot know what one thinks unless one has ordered the language that one thinks in into a grammatically correct, semantically elegant sequence that is repeatable, that doesn't immediately fill one with the sense of contradiction. That if you are filled with the sense of absence of contradiction, the mind is basically a comparison machine. It takes everything that it knows and it compares everything that you experience with everything that it knows. And if there's no contradiction, that thought passes, unannounced, normally unnoticed. If there's a contradiction, we experience surprise, alarm, concern, or interest, according to the level of contradiction that's being raised. So we have this peculiar reality that the literal particles that make up the substance that we experience as objective reality, it's not objective, but is generally considered to be objective reality, appears to be this disembodied floating consciousness interacting with a holographic three-dimensional numerical matrix which connects us to neighbouring consciousnesses and to possibly all neighbouring consciousnesses in a kind of data matrix, in a data web that we all experience through our consensus as the reality, the world, the house we live in, the chair we sit on, have all been arrived at through a complex system of consensus. There's almost nothing that you can think of that you know to be real that you are the only person to have ever had any experience of. Think about it. How difficult is it to think an original thought? How difficult is it to think something that you know for certain that no one has ever thought before? I'll leave that with you. You can have some more Robert Anton Wilson. This is maybe logic, just to give you an idea that perhaps the binary digital part of digital virtual reality is probably a slight misnomer. It's a worthy Occam's razor reduction in complexity in order that we can consider it, but reality isn't a succession of on-off switches. It's a succession of probabilistic events that exist as a future probability field, and the interaction of our consciousness on the way that that probability field is iterated into our awareness, and how we perceive and how our paradigm considers that iteration of the probability field, basically defines how we experience what the next moment in time is. But that next moment in time is a maybe, and that maybe is under our own control. It's under our own intent and our own consideration, and it's just down to us to plasticize the reality field ahead of us by the applications of our intellects. Robert Anton Wilson.
Maybe logic was invented by John von Neumann in 1933. Von Neumann is the unappreciated genius of modern science. Scientists appreciate him, but the general public, I don't think, has ever heard of him. He wrote one of the best books on quantum mechanics. He was one of the pioneers of programmable computers. We wouldn't have internet without him. Anyway, maybe logic, one of his major inventions, instead of dividing everything into true and false like Aristotle, which only applies in the abstract. Aristotelian logic only applies if you ignore the sensory, sensual, space-time continuum in which we live. If you take into context we live in a real universe, which we're touching things, bumping into things, kissing things, loving things, hating things, throwing rocks at things, and so on, you realize that most of our perceptions are in the maybe mode. They're not yes or no, they're not true or false, they're just maybes. I think maybe logic is probably the greatest invention of the 20th century. Although, of course, von Neumann had a lot of competition. Koszybski offered an infinite-valued logic in which between yes and no we've got an infinite series of maybes. Anatole Rappaport invented a four-valued logic: true, false, indeterminate, and meaningless. Indeterminate is something which, in principle, we might be able to test someday, but right now we can't. We don't have the technology to test it. Like how much life is there in the universe. We just don't know. That's indeterminate. Meaningless are propositions that can never be tested because they're defined so they can't be tested, such as round squares eat red cabbage. First you got to find a round square before you can even begin to observe its eating habits. And since you can't find a round square, there's no way of ever testing that. Another one is the Catholic doctrine that after a priest pronounces the right formula over a piece of bread, it becomes the body of a Jew who died 2,000 years ago. If cannibalism is good for you, you should eat the body of the dead Jew and it'll make you feel good. I don't know, Catholics are not particularly fond of Jews. I don't know why they like that one so much, but they like eating him anyway. Everybody else thinks they're just eating bread. They think they're eating a human being. They think they're Hannibal Lecter. We think they're nuts. I don't know. But that's an example of a meaningless statement. It can't be proven or disproven. If they want to think they're cannibals, let them think it. We can't disprove it. We're not going to bother arguing about it. It's meaningless, like the round squares.
So, I hope to have assembled a meaningful alternative model to that one, the one that is presented by the SI model that is currently being presented through all the mainstream medias. The few places that you will find holographic reality presented, I'm afraid that you have the likes of Leonard Susskind and even Sir Roger Penrose presenting various holographic reality theories. I can absolutely assure you, having gone there, that all of their theories are dependent on rubbish like black holes, dark matter, quantum theory. There are self-coherent models in their paradigm, but bear no resemblance to reality. What we hopefully have presented for you tonight is an assemblage, at least, of what is out there within this field, Anybody that's had their interest piqued by tonight's show can go to my old Freeman Jack channel rather than the Omniversity. There's not so much on there. On my Freeman Jack channel, you will find on YouTube an absolute mass of material on this subject. It won't be as strict as the Omniversity material. There'll be a lot more probablys and a lot more perhapses in the dialogue, but through the years I've essentially tried to take the listener through my own personal voyage into this subject and present every new discovery that I made to the listener, and effectively turn my apprentice listeners into initiates. Some of them come back to me after years and say that they've finally got it. Nick was mentioning that in the recording that we had of him. I can say with some confidence that even Vin, our great and glorious leader, has spent several bizarre, when we had a radio station changeover, and it was a rather hurried event over the course of a long weekend. Vin reported back to me after the event that he'd actually spent the entire sort of 48 or so hours that he'd spent awake doing all of the various business required in the name change and all of the various dealings, listening to my previous shows on a playlist for the entire time. I also had Debs come back to me after discovering me and report that she'd also foregone an entire weekend of a girls' weekend, raging in the town and having lots of fun, and had instead spent the entire weekend listening to old recordings of mine, having discovered this theory. So certainly there's an awful lot of my material on this. If you wish to explore it further, there are also lots of other minds breaching this subject as we sort of move forward into the 21st century. But this is 21st century science. A lot of this wasn't even, you couldn't even think about this until the domestic PC arrived. The domestic PC has given us the semantics of digital virtual holographic reality, as has the laser revolution, as has holograms. There's a lot I've missed out tonight. There's a lot that I wish that I had covered, that I know that I've not. I know that I'm going to regret when I listen to the pod. Thank you for staying with me to this wee late hour. I'm going to carry on with tunes now until, I don't know, whatever witching hour I deem fit to finally abandon your ears. I know the chat's beginning to clear out at this late hour. So what have we got here for you? Oh, I don't know, but it's good anyway. Good night, Omniversity.